For the next session, please welcome to the stage the CEO of Investopedia, Mr. David Siegel.
Hello, everyone. Okay, who here has ever heard of or used Investopedia in the past? Raise your hand. Come on. Okay, thank you. So if you've used it, every time that we have someone use our site, we get 6 pennies. So what that means is that from the 50 or 70 people that raised their hand over here right now, we just made enough for me to take a subway home after I ride back in New York. So thank you all very, very much. Okay, so we're here to learn about how to predict investor behavior and predict market returns. That's a really great thing to learn in only like 17 minutes. So here we go. So I'm going to start with a story. And here it is. August 24th, 2015, the market, before opening up, the Dow was down over 1,000 points. My head's in my hand, I'm like freaking out, and I'm like, I can't believe what's going to happen to my 401k. This is terrible. Suddenly, the head of marketing for Investopedia runs into my office, and he says, David, you're not going to believe it. I'm like, what? He said, our short selling tutorial is like going up like crazy. Everyone's trying to learn how to short sell right now. So I said, wow, that's incredibly interesting that right at the same time that tons of people are trying to leave the market, there's a lot of people on Investopedia and learning about short selling. So we looked at, here's the traffic, and you can see a big peak over here when the August 24th, 2015, big peak in terms of number of people looking at short selling, and then early January 2016, most people don't know this, but the first 3 weeks in January 2016 was actually the worst 3 weeks in a market ever. And at that time, short selling also started taking off. So we then looked at another piece of data, and we found that I wonder how the term correction, because on Investopedia you can look up lots of terms, I wonder how the term correction does. Does the word correction, if the market's down like 2%, what happens? And amazingly, the word correction is actually looked up, doubles in traffic in a time when our market's down. So we thought, okay, this is pretty interesting because maybe it's the opposite of Vegas. Because in Vegas, what do they say? They say, what happens in Vegas, what? Stays in Vegas, right? But maybe what happens on Investopedia doesn't necessarily have to stay on Investopedia, but can predict other things for the market. So we decided to create something called the Investopedia Anxiety Index. Okay? Because what brand doesn't want to associate itself with anxiety, right? And it's a great association to have. So we created this index, and it's based on the number of people who are looking up terms like inflation and deflation and bankruptcy and correction and short selling, all these anxiety-provoking terms that if hundreds of thousands of people around the U.S. are looking up, chances are not such a good thing, right? So we created this Investopedia Anxiety Index, and then we decided to plot it. So here's the index, and it's plotted. And then if you look, okay, big peak for Lehman Brothers, 100 is an average, big peak for Lehman Brothers collapse, and then a big peak for the Greek bailout, another peak for U.S. credits downgraded, not so many peaks when oil prices, etc. And then we decided to do something that is pretty interesting. On the top is the anxiety index, which is how many people are looking up some of those anxiety-provoking terms like bankruptcy and recession. And on bottom is the VIX. What's the VIX? Someone raise their hand. What's the VIX? What's the VIX? Volatility index, right. What is the nickname for the VIX? What else is the VIX known as? The fear index, right? So we thought, well, okay, we have something called the fear index, and we have something called the anxiety index. Now, the fear index is based on all this options, buying and selling, very, very complicated basis for figuring out the fear index of the VIX. And the anxiety index is how many people are looking up these anxiety-provoking terms on Investopedia. They should not be correlated. But look at what happens when you put them on top of each other. They're almost exactly correlated at the same time. But much more important than correlated is what? Is it more important to be a leading metric or a lagging metric? You want to be a leading metric. If you're a lagging metric, who cares? You can't actually predict anything. If, taking out umbrellas is correlated with raining, but taking out umbrellas does not cause rain. We all know that, right? But if the anxiety index peaks prior to the VIX, then that is actually potentially something big. So look at it. So look what happened. Every single time, 2008, Lehman Brothers, anxiety, the blue, peaked right before the VIX. Again, in 2010, anxiety index peaking before the VIX. Again, each of the different times that there's been a peak in volatility in the market, a peak in anxiety, which typically means the market's going to go down, the anxiety index peaks prior to it, which is amazing, right? So now, I don't know if you remember this or not, but in February of this year, the VIX went up like crazy. Who remembers that? You remember that? Okay. In one day, the VIX went up by 110% in one day. So you invested $1,000, you now had $2,000 at the end of the day. Okay, one day it went up by 110%. So we thought to ourselves, wow, I wonder what happened to the anxiety index this year right before that huge pop by the VIX. Are you interested? Okay, so let's see what happened. OMG, right? So in red is the VIX. And you can see on February, looks like 5th, the VIX went up 115%. For the 7 previous days before the VIX went up, the anxiety index was steadily increasing prior to that. That doesn't make any sense, right? Why would that be happening? The reason why it happens is because on Investopedia, people are educating themselves about finance. People are researching different terms. And if hundreds of thousands of people are potentially doing research on bankruptcy or doing research on short selling, chances are, at some point in the future, some percentage of them may choose to then take action. Because we have an audience that's highly intent-driven, we could actually then potentially predict different things. So what we did is we gave all of this data for the last 11 years of Investopedia to a third party. And we said, is there a potential trading strategy that can be used and using the anxiety index to potentially help in market returns? So we gave it to them, and without going into too much detail here, the orange is using the anxiety index as a filter, which essentially means that when anxiety is high, do you want to be in the market or out of the market if anxiety is high? You want to be out of the market, of course. When anxiety is low, you want to be in the market. So they did a very simple strategy of determining whether or not you want to be in the market or out of the market, depending on whether the Investopedia anxiety index is high or low. And they found that there's actually a 460 basis point improvement of the orange versus the gray, which is using the VIX, which is really cool. And then all of these big quant funds that take lots of data started calling us up. You probably have heard of them, 2 Sigma, Millennial, World Quant, etc., and said, how do we get access to your data? We haven't actually shared any of that data with them at this point, but they're asking a lot of questions, and we're deciding whether or not we want to share it with them or just kind of hold it out for our own to create, the future Investopedia ETF or something. So we'll see. Talking about that, on our site, at any point in time, it's updated all the time. You can look at the anxiety index. It happens to be only 100 right now. At the time when I think the biggest peak of the last year was when Trump was elected. It had about a 120 at that time. And when there was a Twitter war between Trump and Korea, it actually went up to a 120 as well. Right now, there's 3 different types of anxiety. We look at macroeconomic anxiety, which is low, market-based anxiety, which is higher, and then debt and credit anxiety, which is right now green, which is lower. So we looked at all that. We're now in the process of creating all these other different indices on Investopedia, which I think is a really interesting way for a potential publisher to differentiate itself. Okay, now let me ask you a question to talk a little bit more about data that you might find interesting on our site. What city do you think will have the highest propensity to want to look up information about restricted stock units, RSUs, which are kind of like options, restricted stock units? If you're not sure what the definition is of RSUs, awesome website out there. I'm sure you know what it is, and you can look it up there. Restricted stock units. What city do you think is going to be the most on that one? What do you think? Nicholas? New York. Nicholas says New York. What does Sharpie say? San Francisco, Sharpie says. Anyone other guesses? Chicago? The answer is Sharpie's right. So it's, we can look up every single term, and there's like 15,000 terms on Investopedia. We have 200,000 articles, and we look it up by geography. And we can say, what this means, by the way, is that restricted stock unit is the 10th most looked up term in San Francisco, and it's only the 209th most looked up term in Toronto. We create heat maps, which is, I think, pretty cool. So what state is the top left corner? Any non-New Yorkers actually know what the state is in the top left corner? Just kidding. So in Washington State, it has Amazon, it has Microsoft. So what you can see over there is that there's a lot of people looking up RSUs because of the startups there. There's a lot of startups, obviously, in California. There are startups in New York. Biotech is big in Massachusetts. And I think what's pretty cool is you see the state in the middle kind of the United States. It's a little bit darker blue. What state is that? Colorado, because in Boulder, there's a whole startup scene and lots of startup companies there. So you can actually see so many different patterns and interesting stories about just looking at things from a geographic perspective. You can look at it from gender perspective, all these different things. Okay, a couple last ones for you. Okay, total random article, retiring in the Philippines with $200,000. Totally random, right? Like, why would we choose that? And you look at it and you're like, what's going on here? Why does Nevada have the highest number of people that want to retire in the Philippines? Well, the Philippines is kind of, over here or here. So lots of people on the West Coast may want to retire there. Okay, that makes sense. The actual reason for it is because Nevada has the highest Filipino population density. So there's like a story behind almost everything. And you could take any article that we have 200,000 articles on our site, and you could find out really interesting data to potentially predict things about, or to understand things better about what happens in the future. So I thought I would share that. Last one over here, Bitcoin by state. So for some reason, I think you could probably guess, people in Florida that are retirees, 70, 80 years old, do not want to invest in Bitcoin. I have no idea why. It's not like it's speculative at all, but the state with the kind of really, not high level of interest is certainly Florida. You can see some other states that have pretty low level of interest. People in Mississippi certainly don't want to. It's a very much a West Coast thing, which is pretty interesting how much Bitcoin is very much a West Coast thing, which kind of, again, makes some sense because it's also it's very big in Asia as well, which is also influenced by there, and then in New York as well. And again, you could do this with lots of different types of content. Okay, last couple of things. So a little bit about Investopedia. Our entire mission as a company is to empower people to make smarter financial decisions. The state of financial literacy in this country is woeful. It's really depressing. Of the 20 largest GDP countries out there, we are number 14 out of 20. We are the wealthiest country in the world, and we are the 14th most financially savvy. Average retirement is only $60,000. Rather than people investing, they have 70% of money in cash. 50% of people in the U.S. consider themselves financially illiterate. And oh, by the way, 80% of people consider themselves above average drivers. So people tend to overrate themselves. So more than 50% are actually financially illiterate. So at Investopedia, what did we do? We took a bus all around the United States. This is actually, I swear to you, Justin Bieber's former bus. Not kidding. We took this huge bus, and we had all these financial advisors on the bus with us, where we, pun intended, drove financial freedom on the financial coach. Bump. And we help to educate people to help learn about finance. We had all these financial advisors on our side, on the bus, and we had tens of thousands of people to help to really educate them to learn more about finance and help to really drive savings, which is our core mission. Last 2 minutes left. We have about 30 million monthly users. We have 4 million newsletter subscribers. We launched something called Investopedia Academy 1 year ago. So we are offering all these courses. And yes, every person who is listening here will be able to get a 50% discount on any one of our courses. And I could show you how. We have courses on how to learn finance in Excel, how to do technical stock investing, how to do financial modeling, how to do options trading, all of these different areas. Our courses have like a NPS, Net Promoter Score, really high, and very high customer satisfaction. So without further ado, if anyone is interested in getting a copy of this presentation, just send an email to communications@investopedia.com. That is communications with an S. And it will not be ignored. You will get a copy of the PowerPoint if that's what you want. And if what you want is to get a discount for any Investopedia Academy course, and we have about 30 courses right now, then you could look at our courses and you get a discount to any course that you want. I hope this is helpful, and I hope that now you're all going to be making massive amounts of money and predicting future stock market investing by looking at the Investopedia Anxiety Index at least 5 to 10 times a day. Have a wonderful rest of the time at Collision, and enjoy New Orleans.